I am happy to present our first speaker in this first session, the Professor Hans Ruprecht Goette. He's professor of classical archaeology at the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin and the University of Gießen in Germany. He has done extensive surveys in Greece and has excavated on Aegina. He has published on Greek and Roman portrait sculpture and on ancient Greek topography and architecture. His publications include Studien zu römischen Darstellungen, Hoaxiologos de Musunion, Athens, Attica and the Megarid, an archaeological guide, and several co-authored books in Attic sites such as Marathon and the Cave of Pan at Bari. He also edited Ancient Roads in Greece, Proceedings of a Symposium at Athens, and co-edited with Olga Palagia, Ludwig Ross und Griechenland. So welcome here. Thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and, of course, for the invitation to this conference. I start with my talk. The appreciation of old and therefore pagan statues in late antiquity is a well-documented and generally recognized phenomenon. But the nature, extent, and distribution of newly produced marble sculptures during this period, especially those of a reasonable size, has been discussed for decades and was and still is highly controversial. Some archaeologists think that large statues of pagan motifs, thus giving the rise of Christianity an important impact in this development, have not been produced anymore in late antiquity. Others tried during the past 25 years to show that this view is not correct. A key role in this discussion is played by an ensemble of 5 life-size statues in the Nikolsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, the so-called Esquilin group, or, misleadingly, the Sette Sala sculptures, for which a long-lasting discussion has been going on with regard to their date of production. This aporia points to a fundamental methodological problem in classical archaeology. The current state of research on this group of sculptures is characterized by the fact that the methods commonly used in archaeology for dating sculptures have sometimes been applied only in a selection and not altogether. In this case, it is about epigraphy and prosopography, together with a find context, and finally, preferably at the end and not in the beginning, leading to the analysis of style. The statues in the Nikolsberg Glyptothek from the Esquilin in Rome have been interpreted up to the late 1990s, mostly as works from the late 2nd century AD, thus supporting the long-held assumption that after the Tetrarchic era, no large-format images of pagan gods, especially not copies of older, here Hellenistic designs, were produced. At one point, in the 1980s, some epigraphists dated the sculptures according to prosopographical attribution of the sculptors as works of late antiquity. And from then on, the very influential archaeologists, the experts' eyes, relied on this epigraphical interpretation and looked for good arguments for stating that the stylistic analysis does not contradict a late antique production date of those statues. The phenomenon of the similarities of the late antique style and that of the Antonine era, which bothered so many researchers for a long time, was phrased by Niels Hannestad, one of the scholars who understandably fought for the acknowledgement of a big late antique production of small and large-scale sculptures. He said, that is what it is all about, meaning the late antique sculptors not only worked in a long-lasting workshop tradition, but they even competed with their forerunners to reach that very high quality of marble sculpting. In 2013, An article in German, some years before she published the same in Italian, which was not much acknowledged, in 2013 was published by Christiane Forster, an article, one of the experts in this field. She collected and discussed many examples of late antique sculptures made in Rome and determined their style. Doing so, she supported the views by Marianne Bergmann, who carefully argued more than 10 years earlier for a late antique workshop of Aphrodisias in Asia Minor. Both scholars reconstructed a workshop originating in that Carian town, whose sculptors were traveling around the Mediterranean and chiseling statues, statuettes, and reliefs, mostly using their hometown marble from the quarries of Goette, a little bit south of Aphrodisias, but other marbles from Asia Minor as well, so transporting that marble across the ancient world. After those studies, and after quite a number of research on that material by others and by excavation and investigation in Aphrodisias itself, especially through the publication of a sculpture workshop in that town, we seem to know a lot more about late antique sculptures. And I want to confess here that I see in many cases the same. That is, there are pagan statues in late antiquity which have been chiseled anew, mostly for the decoration of lavishly furnished villas. We find them all around the ancient world as well, for example, on the Iberian Peninsula, two floors up here, and we can note that the majority of them are very fine mythological statuettes. I'm coming back now to the Esquilin statues and to the article by Christiane Forster with her fundamental critique, as the expert's eye obviously very influential for scholars who later studied those statues found in Rome. Almost all of them changed their mind and do not date them anymore to the high imperial period, but into late antiquity. What was her reasoning? Let's look at the evidence. The inscriptions and their interpretation, the fine context and the resulting consequences for the epigraphical explanation, and at the end, very shortly, the stylistic analysis. First, the inscriptions. On the front part of the plinths of those 5 statues in Copenhagen, there are Greek inscriptions naming persons from Aphrodisias, who tell that they made those figures. Epoiei in Greek. Although fragmented, we learn from them about a Flavius Zenon, a Flavius Chryseros, and a Flavius Andronikos. Interestingly, those persons, or should I say those names, have been found in inscriptions in Aphrodisias too. The first of them inscribed his titles as a komes and as a diasemotatos, in Latin perfectissimus. These titles caused the expert epigraphist Charlotte Rocher to date the inscriptions to 320 to 350 AD, so in the time of Constantine to the mid-4th century AD. And this was and is the basis for the new chronology of the Esquilin statues and the analysis of their style. Rocher's short mention that all the titles are known from a few inscriptions to be dated already in the beginning of the 3rd century AD was usually ignored by the archaeologists, by Forster too. But recently, 2 other epigraphists gathered quite a number of epigraphical examples underlining the possibility of an earlier appearance of those titles. And in terms of methodology, I would like to emphasize that the chronology of an official title in the Roman social system, so komes and diasemotatos, I mean its first appearance, should be based on secured dates of the inscription itself or on its fine context. The inscription itself does not give us any hint, so the fine context. And that leads us to the second part of the argument, the excavation on the Esquilin Hill in Rome. The fragments of the 5 statues and their inscriptions now in Copenhagen have been found built into a long zigzag wall, so purely used as stone material, All statues were intentionally cut into pieces after taken from their original setting. After their discovery in 1885, they have been restored, sold in 1893 to Carl Jacobsen in Denmark, and much later repaired anew to their present state, which you saw on these slides. And it is important to note that the 5 statues were not the only sculptural fragments built into that wall, but we know of many more sculptures, which were taken from that wall, which was then in private property, and therefore mostly could be sold to various museums, not only in Rome, but for example in New York or in Budapest or in Copenhagen as well. The chronological range of the production of those statues is from the late Republican times to the late 2nd century AD. As they could be reconstructed from their fragments, and since many of them show gold and color on their surfaces, it should be deduced that they have been taken almost intact and as a whole set from a place, maybe nearby, smashed into pieces and then built into the so-called statue wall. From all this evidence, we learn that there is, aside from the epigraphical interpretation of the signatures on the plinths, no hint and no argument deriving from the fine context about the date of manufacture of the Esquilin group. Scholars argued that the statue wall should be dated to medieval times, but they did not say for which purpose it has been built at that period. And how would it be possible in medieval times to find so many intact, even gilded and colored marble statues, to cut them into pieces and use them as stone material for that wall? Therefore, in recent years, it has been proposed to date the statue wall to the years after 270 AD or into Tetrarchic period, after the destruction of Rome under Valentinian II. If this is correct, it would provide a valuable terminus antequem for the production of the Esquilin statues in Copenhagen, and I will come back to this soon. Discussing the inscriptions of those Aphrodisian sculptors, we need to get to some other context on the Esquilin Hill. There have been some more statues with signatures by persons from Aphrodisian workshops. While from all excavations in Rome 20 such signatures are known, 18 of these come from the excavations on the Esquilin Hill and most probably belonged to the group of statues under discussion here. This means the debate is concentrated by now only on a very small percentage of the material once extant. So 18 statues, but 5 are discussed only. 2 of the inscriptions with signatures by Aphrodisian sculptors, one of them Flavius Zenon, whom we know from the plinths in Copenhagen, have been excavated in an ancient architectural context, namely in the foundations of a bath once belonging to a nice villa on the Esquilin. Today this bath is known as the baths in Via Ariosto, but at the time of the excavation in January 1874, this road did not exist, not yet. And therefore, in early reports on those finds, the bath is sometimes labeled as situated in a different road, like in the road on Sette Sale, which did not exist as well. But this incorrect naming did not prevent researchers like Forster to call the Esquilin group Sette Sale statues, and finally resulting in the hypothesis that the figures once decorated a villa on top of the water reservoir called Sette Sale. Here is the first hint to a very suggestive but circular argument, without any basis. In addition, the reasoning is getting even worse. Let me quickly quote in English translation the German critique by Forster. The attribution of the Flavius Zenon inscription above on the left to the bath complex of the Via Ariosto near Piazza Dante is not supported by any of the find reports. A connection between the Flavius Zenon inscription with the bath complex from Via Ariosto, which was completely excavated and destroyed in 1874, can be ruled out with a probability bordering to certainty. Additional confusion is caused by another Aphrodisioi signature. You see it with this red frame around it, which was found in a bathing complex on the Esquiline in the area of the Via Merulana. It is again a statue plinth, but only the last two letters of the artist's name have survived. Whether the location of this Aphrodisios inscription originates from a different bath complex on the Via Merulana cannot be decided in view of the extremely large number of late antique baths in this area. And Forster continues, here the methodological problem in classical archaeology comes into sharp focus, as the question arises as to how it is possible that the context of a single inscription, which is not documented anywhere, could be regarded as a certain fact, although it is in obvious contradiction to the well-founded results of the epigraphic, Goette, and ancient historical research, and does not stand up to closer examination. Apparently, the hypothetical context of the find served as a welcome reason of traditional sculpture research that there were no large formed images of gods in late antiquity. End of quote. To note it from the beginning, Forster's fundamental critique she phrased as the expert against other, in her view, non-expert researchers, but prejudiced traditional scholars who do not recognize new research, has to be turned against herself. She's talking of one inscription from the baths in Via Ariosto, but the excavation reports give three, two of them naming Aphrodisios. She announces without any proving that there have been an extremely large number of late antique baths in this area, but we know from the old excavations, from studies of the archival material, and from new research that there has been just and only one, namely the one in Via Ariosto. She states that there is no reliable or even justifiable dating of the find context, but already the excavators in 1874 and again new excavation carried out in 2005 on the basis of stratigraphical research showed the contrary. By the way, the new excavations did prove that Forster's statement all the remains of the bath have been destroyed, totally destroyed in 1874, again is wrong. The building had four construction phases, the first in the second half of the 2nd century AD, the third in the time of Maxentius, which could be dated by stamps on the hypocaust bricks to the early years of the 4th century. The excavation report from 1874 is very clear in that it states that the profiled plinth of a statue with the inscription of the Aphrodisian sculptor Flavius Zenon and that of the second one were found built into the foundations of that bath. This means, without any doubt, that the plinths need to be dated before the beginning of the 4th century, a clear terminus antiquem neglected by Forster and other expert researchers. And it is even more. The excavator explicitly wrote that the statues did belong to the earlier phase of that building, 2nd century AD. And of course, we need to think about some time period the statues were set up and did decorate a building before they've been cut into pieces. In addition, we know of fragments of 52 statues and 3 inscriptions incorporated into the foundations of the Tetrarchic bath in Via Ariosto. The oldest sculpture is a late Hellenistic labrum with fine floral decoration. Most of the statues, some are copies of famous Greek types, are works of the 2nd century up to the late Antonine period. Statues by 2 Aphrodisian sculptors of late and antique times would be the only examples in this complex dating more than 200 years later than all the others. But, as I said, the excavation results exclude a date after Tetrarchic times. And it seems not by chance that this evidence coincides perfectly with the proposed date of the statue wall containing the fragments of the Esquiline sculptures and their inscribed plinths in Copenhagen, namely after 270 AD. Now, of course, the question arises if we need to follow the experts, Niels Hannestad, Marianne Bergmann, Christiane Foster, and others, in their stylistical analysis, our last point of discussion. In April of this year, I had the opportunity to discuss this matter in front of the statues with Mette Moltesen, who wrote several articles about the Esquiline group, dated them first to the 2nd century and then changed her mind, and changed her mind to late antiquity, and with Marianne Bergmann, who proposed the group being part of the late antique sculptural production of an Aphrodisian workshop. During that long-lasting discussion and the studies of the inscriptions as well as the sculptures, Bergmann confessed that she now prefers a late Antonine date for those sculptures in Copenhagen, not on the basis of the fine context, but on the basis of her expert eye on style. So she changed her mind since 1999. And this has been supported in 2018 as well by Julie van Vores through the study of some statues found in a workshop in Aphrodisias itself. The statues are worked from white and grey marble deriving from the quarries of Goette, south of Aphrodisias. The workshop mostly used that fine-grained marble, which was quarried even in a dark blue or black quality. Especially noteworthy is the fact that the muscles of the figures are very strong, exaggeratedly pronounced. This is a tradition the workshop took from Hellenistic sculpture and carried on down into late antiquity. The head of the statue of Heracles from the Esquiline group in Copenhagen shows hair with strands separated by deep channels produced with a drill. But in some parts, a very fine bridge over these channels has been left connecting two locks. Particularly, this is the only depiction without sculptural indication of the iris and the pupil of the eyes, something to be expected from Hadrianic times on, and, as you will see, extant on the other figures. I guess that with this figure alone, as you see it in my slide, nobody would propose a late antique date for the statue. This can be supported by comparison with similar depictions of Heracles like those on the late antique reliefs from Chiragan in Toulouse. A detailed study of the way how the strands and locks have been chiseled shows the differences, while scholars are sure that the same workshop from Aphrodisias executed those sculptures. The same can be said about the muscular form of the bodies and legs, to be interpreted as a motif, but not as the style. The form of the statue's marble supports, like the tree-trunk, with its finely drilled holes at places of broken branches, does not exist on late antique trees. And since several years, there are 2 more copies of the satyr type found in Aphrodisias itself, which recent scholarship dates convincingly to the late 2nd or early 3rd century AD. A look at the 2 centaurs produced by the Aphrodisian sculptors Papias and Aristeas, they inscribed their names, and found in the villa of Hadrian in Tivoli, and always dated to Hadrianic times, underlines clearly the exaggerated formulas of muscle depictions in Hadrianic times, and thus the long tradition already mentioned. The check on the style of the eyes may give us an additional clue. I do not show you comparisons of late Antonine portraits, which are very similar. If you go to Copenhagen, you can do so, because the group is exhibited inside the galleries with the portraits. But I show you some examples of late antique date above of Valentinian II, then of the late antique owner of the villa in Chiragan, and below of an unidentified emperor in Istanbul of the 5th century AD. The differences are, at least in my view, obvious. Marianne Bergmann discussed the meandering scheme of curls with pointed drilling, which is best to be observed at the Helios figure of the Copenhagen group. A comparison with that motif on a statue of Helios from the late antique villa in Silataraga at Istanbul, or on the statuette of Christ in Rome, signify the differences in workmanship of the scheme, the formula, and thus the different date of production. To determine the well-known style of the Esquilene sculptures in Copenhagen, a look at the famous group of the Commodus Heracles bust in Rome with its accompanying tritons is valuable. All three sculptures have been found on the Esquilene nearby our group, and all three are produced from Goette marble by the Aphrodisian workshop. The workmanship of the long hair of the tritons is in its details the same as that on the mythological figures of the Copenhagen group. I could show it to you by a careful and time-consuming study, but I hope that you can observe the long channels between the strands and the fine bridges and many more details as very similar on the Esquilene heads and on the tritons. And the same is true when checking the mane of the lion skin on Commodus' head, and in an even finer work on his hair and beard. Of course, the motifs of the hair are different at the portrait from that of the mythological figures, but how the drill is used, how the surface of the strands is characterized like fine hair, that is so very similar that I see a close relationship in workmanship, in style, and therefore in date. A last word about the interpretation of the titles Comes and Perfectissimus, Diasemotatus for Flavius Zenon on the plinths of the Esquilene group. Rocher wrote that the title Diasemotatus, I quote, first appeared under the Severi for high officials in the equestrian administration by imperial officials. And later she writes, I quote again, the title Comes was a rare and significant epithet of the emperor's companions, end of quote. So one may ask, is it possible that those Aphrodisian sculptors who worked in Rome can be regarded as such officials and companions of the emperors of the Antonine or Severan court? I think it may be possible because we now, only since a few years, know that the Aphrodisian workshop in Rome produced all the very best portraits and sculptures for those emperors, especially for their villas. The inscriptional term epoiae, that is, principally they made the statues, which we read on the plinths, can be understood as well as the signature of the workshop's owner, the head of the workshop in Rome and in Aphrodisias, so in two distant towns. Such an owner, who delivers in Rome the very best portraits of the members of the imperial family and wonderful statues for their villas, may have had an equestrian rank and close contact to the imperial court. He could be a companion of the emperor. Thank you very much.